everybody. My name is Fiona Robertson, and I've come here from the British Council. And I'm really sorry, my Arabic is really bad, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to speak English. Okay? I'm here to speak a little bit about the history of the English language. I don't know if you know anything about the history of the English language, but I'm going to start with way back, okay? I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about the ancient history of the English language. Yeah, okay, thank you, thanks. Okay, I'll stand over here. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture. Okay, what do you think this is a picture of? Or where does it come from? Any idea where this comes from? Is it the UK? Is it Britain? Look at these words. Have you got any idea what they mean? Any idea what these words might mean? We've got brother, tree, moose, and Peter. Let's have a look. Brata is brother. Tree is three. Moose is mouth. And Peter is father. Okay, and the first words are Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the classical language which is spoken in India, is used in India even today. And this is to show you that we actually have a very close relationship between Sanskrit and Indian. And that's because English is an Indo-European language. So about 10,000 years ago, tribes from Central Asia made their way across Europe and eventually settled in Britain. And all the languages, nearly all the languages in Europe are Indo-European languages, and they are related to Indian languages. Okay, we're going to jump to the 5th century AD, so 500 years after Christ was born, after Jesus Christ was born. And look what happens. So we had tribes living in Britain. They were quite happy there. They had their own languages. And at a certain point in the 5th century, warlike tribes from Denmark invaded Britain. These tribes were called the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. And they invaded Britain and they settled there. And the Angles gave the name to England. So Angleland became England. So these tribes who spoke a kind of language which is related to German and Dutch today settled in Britain. And the language of the people who were living in Britain at the time, the Celtic language, was pushed up and only a very few people spoke it. So we have languages in Scotland, in Wales and Ireland which are related to ancient Celtic languages. But the Angles and the Saxons brought their language to Britain. Okay, so England, it now becomes England. And here are some words which these people brought with them. So child, home, eat, drink, day and night. Now these are all words which were brought in the 5th century and became a fundamental part of the English language. Now, the Anglo-Saxon language, only 1% of the English language is made up of Anglo-Saxon words. But Anglo-Saxon words make up half of our daily language. So all the words which we use commonly, okay, words like child, like family, like home, are very, very old words from the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, so they're now 1% of the modern English language, but they're 50% of our daily words. So if you read a very simple book or a newspaper, one of the very popular newspapers, they'll be made up of Anglo-Saxon words. Okay, now, I don't know if you've seen this film. Has anyone seen this film, Beowulf? Okay. So Beowulf was taken from one of the earliest poems in English that was actually written down. It's an epic poem, and it's very beautiful, but it's very difficult to understand because it's written in Old English. So Beowulf was written about 800 AD, but it was written down about 200 years later. It's very poetic, and it has some very strange words in it. For example, Banhouse, which is bone house. What do you think that means, bone house? Your bone house is your body. Okay, the house of bones, it actually means the body. And Honrad means whale road, okay, the road of the whales. And that's what, in Beowulf, is the sea. They call the sea the road of the whales. So it's very creative, has very creative language. Old English or Anglo-Saxon, if you know any words in English that you didn't learn at school, any very rude words, don't say them. But these words are probably Old English. Excuse me. Then the Vikings invaded. So the Vikings came from Norway, from Scandinavia. And they brought with them some more words. Words like skin and leg and sister. These are all Viking words. So the English language started to become richer. Okay, we started to have more words, more vocabulary. So now we had a choice of words. We had the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English word wish, and the Vikings want. So two words that meant the same thing, but you could choose. Also, sick is the Anglo-Saxon word and ill is the Viking word. Wrath is the Anglo-Saxon word and anger is the Viking word. Now, Britain has not been invaded for a very long time. The last time it was invaded was by the Normans, the French, and that was in 1066. Okay, so well over 1,000 years ago. And the Normans came from France and successfully invaded Britain. And obviously they brought their own language, which was a kind of Old French. So now there were two languages in Britain. There was Old English and French. And French was the language of the ruling class, of the aristocracy, of the government. And English was the language of the common people. Okay, so the church as well. Anybody who was educated spoke French. The lower classes, the farmers, spoke English. So the words that came from France were words like parliament, government, soldier. Also peace, beauty, poet. These are all words that come from the Romance languages, from French. Geoffrey Chaucer was one of the most famous poets of the time. It's very difficult to understand him because his English is very different from the English that we speak now. Because of the French invasion, we had even more synonyms, okay? So now you could choose between infant, which is the French word, and child. Or liberty and freedom, liberty being the French word. Close and shut. Forest is the French word, and wood is the Anglo-Saxon word. Okay, but now, English was the language of the poor people, of the common people. And this was great because they decided that it was not necessary to have a very complicated grammatical system. Okay, so luckily for people who learn English now, all kinds of complicated grammar forms were abolished in the Middle English period. Okay, so if you have studied English, you know that, for example, the past tense is always the same. Okay, you don't have to remember many rules. You have to remember a lot of words, but you don't have to remember a lot of grammar in English. Other languages like German, Italian are much more complicated. But as you probably know, the difficult thing about English is the spelling. And this again was due to the French. It was all the fault of the French that our spelling system was so difficult. In Middle English period, okay, they decided to try and have a system for the spelling, but the system was a little bit irrational. It was a bit illogical. So an E at the end of a word meant that the vowel was long. So we have words like nose, okay? But it doesn't really have any logical sense. Another thing that they did was sometimes they would put an H in front of a word which was silent, and sometimes it was pronounced. So you had habit, okay, herb, but honor, you don't pronounce the H. Okay, another thing they did was to double a consonant in front of a short vowel. Okay, so the double T means that the I is short, sitting. But these rules are very difficult to remember if you're a learner of English. Also, they put O instead of U for example, love, which is okay? For some reason, in Middle English times, they put the letter O. So again, it's not very logical. In 1476, the first printing press arrived. So this meant that there was a huge change in the language because the public now had access to printed books. So William Caxton brought the first printing press from Germany. Now this meant that they had to standardize English, because if you're printing books, everybody in the whole of England was supposed to be able to understand the written word. So they use the London and the London dialect for printed material. And spelling became a little more regular, so that spelling was supposed to be the same in all printed material. It wasn't exactly like that for a long time afterwards. Now, this is Queen Elizabeth I, who lived in the 16th and 17th century, the same time as Shakespeare. And this was a great time of learning in Europe. And Latin was the language of the intellectuals. Okay, so at that time, a lot of Latin words became absorbed into the English language. So words like genius and focus, species, these are all words that have come from Latin. Squalor is another one. So we have English is starting to become a really rich language. We have Anglo-Saxon words, we have French words, we have Latin words. Who's this? William Shakespeare, right, okay. Now, he was very, very important in the evolution of the English language. There are a lot of idioms that William Shakespeare used in his writing that have become part of our daily language. So, love at first sight. Have you ever heard this or said this? This was Shakespeare that invented this phrase. As luck would have it, in my mind's eye, love is blind. These were all things that Shakespeare wrote. But he also created about 50,000 words, which became absorbed into the English language. So Shakespeare, words like eyeball, vast, hurry, accommodation were all words that were actually invented by William Shakespeare. Now, between the 16th and the 18th century, the Navy, the British Navy, became very strong. The British started to have very good, were very good with ships, and they started to travel around the world very widely. And this meant that not only was English growing in Britain, but we were also absorbing words from many countries around the world. So here are some words which became adopted into English. Where do you think we got these words from? Alcohol and mattress and jar, magazine. These words all came from Arabic. Okay, these are words that we got from you. Now, of course, then Britain started to expand, and the British Empire started to spread around the world, for better or for worse. At a certain point, 25% of the world was governed by Britain. So, whereas there were about 6 million native speakers in the 16th century, 200 years later, about 300 million people were using English. So this is when English started to become a global language. Words like pajamas, jungle, and shampoo, these are words that came from India, so the British Empire in India, and they became absorbed into English. Okay, and at this point, the phenomena of having most English speakers not actually living in Britain. Okay, most English speakers at this point were non-native speakers of English, and that has continued ever since. Okay, now let's look at the New World, the USA, very quickly. Some people prefer American English. Some people prefer British English. The people that don't like American say that American words are not real. Somehow they're not as good as English words. But actually, these words, fall, which in British English is autumn, and trash, which in British English is rubbish. I guess in American English, I think in British English, these are all words that were part of very old English. And people took them, the British people took them to America and they remained. So whereas in Britain, these words changed, in America, they stayed in use. And so actually, they are really originally British words. Now, just to conclude, if you look at this, we've got about 400 million people speaking English as native speakers. So in Britain, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, okay, about 400 million people are native speakers of English. Then we have many countries where English is a second language. So countries like Nigeria, India, in the Philippines, okay, people have their own dialects, but then maybe English, like in India, is the language of the government because there are so many different tribal languages. So that's another about 200, 300 million people. But then we have maybe up to 1,000 million people who are learning English because they need to use it in their daily lives. Okay, so many more people, as we can see, are not native speakers of English, okay? So when you worry about your pronunciation, or people ask me, does my pronunciation sound English enough, or is my pronunciation, is it American enough? And say, don't worry, because usually you're going to be speaking English to somebody who is not actually British, okay? Most people are going to be using English to speak to other people who are non-native. So you don't really have to worry about your pronunciation. Okay. Now, that's a very, very brief history of the English language. I'm going to conclude there. There's a lot of other things I could have said, but I just wanted to give you a small taste of how English has developed over the centuries. Thank you very much.